everyone. Hopefully that gave you a little bit of food for thought. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, welcome to the ISS. My name's Karen Allen. Some may know me from my previous incarnation. I'm now here at the Institute for Security Studies with the explicit and, I have to say, rather daunting task of focusing on emerging threats to human security in Africa. Here at ISS, we're committed to examining the potential future risks posed by rapidly emerging technologies on a scale really not seen before. Artificial intelligence, drone technology, the Internet of Things, some of the things that we saw behind. So we're looking forward to a really interesting discussion. Just a few housekeeping announcements before we start in earnest. We know you're all really busy people, and the focus of this seminar is, of course, tech, but please, would you mind popping your mobile phones onto silent? We're delighted to see you here. It is a seminar that we're seeing you in person, but it's also being webcast or live streamed, and people can follow us via Twitter. So as a result of that, Chatham House rules will not apply. What that means in plain, simple English is that everything you say is on the record and fully attributable. So no libeling anyone, please. I'd like to thank our donors for supporting our work. And also, you'll find that there is an evaluation form. No seminar is a seminar without an evaluation form at the end. So if you loved or you loathe this event, please do let us know. In a moment, I'll be handing over to my colleague, Ottilia Marganidze. She's the ISS Head of Special Projects, who will be our chair, and she'll introduce our panelists. But first, just a few opening remarks and observations from myself. The World Economic Forum on Africa meets in Cape Town next week, as you know, and one phrase which is undoubtedly going to dominate is the Fourth Industrial Revolution, 4IR, a term coined by the West Professor Klaus Schwab, synonymous with global digitization. And it's become something of a buzzword, propelled under the steam of its own media hype. Of course, 4IR has got tremendous potential. There's no denying that. But there are unintended consequences of diving headlong into this digital world without at least considering the downsides, the potential challenges to human security and to Africa in particular. Now, when one talks about techs and threats, cybercrime more often than not is what springs to mind. But cybercrime is more than simply crimes committed using a computer. There are crimes aimed at compromising cyberspace, new forms of crime. But at ISS, we're also interested in how this rapidly evolving technology is shaping real-world outcomes and affecting our geopolitics. How the value attributed to big data is affecting where power lies. And a key part of our strategy will be to examine how it affects the security of the world in which we live. Do we need a new set of standards, new sets of norms to regulate cyber, both as a potential weapon, but also as an operational space? Or do we have the tools already? After all, we have international legal regimes governing how we operate on the high seas, how we operate in space. As discussions of cyber norms intensifies, Africa, we feel, needs to be part of that conversation, surely. And South Africa in particular, given its international leverage and its history in defending human rights, I would suggest needs to lead that charge. So let's be practical. What are we up against in this new digital age? Just last week, we had reports in the news that China was being accused of using fake Twitter and Facebook accounts to undermine the ongoing protests in Hong Kong. We have the usurping of big data by companies such as Cambridge Analytica to shape the way that we think, to influence us as voters at the ballot box. That may seem remote from South Africa, but it's recently emerged that here in South Africa, it's estimated some 60,000 personal data from users was compromised in that original Cambridge Analytica scandal. We've seen already countries like Israel deliver a real-world response to a virtual threat In May, it was reported that the Israeli Defense Forces had launched airstrikes against what they said were Hamas facilities preparing cyber attacks. Now imagine, just imagine, if Kenya were to do something similar against Somalia, or the Combined Joint Task Force in the Horn of Africa, CJF-HOA, were to launch missiles against Yemen. These are very dramatic examples, but emerging threats are not simply based on actions taken by sovereign states or international coalitions. We've seen forensic laboratories in the UK hacked by so-called hacktivists, demanding ransoms, affecting tens of thousands of police investigations. Now, I would advocate, imagine if that happened to us. Imagine how much, we have representatives of the police here, how much investigations and court cases could be crippled. These are some of the things we don't necessarily think about. What about infrastructure? What about ESCOM getting hacked? We've seen it happen in other parts of the world, in the Ukraine. It's something we need to think about here and say, is South Africa prepared to withstand such attacks? We're also seeing a diffusion of power away from sovereign states. Tech that used to be the prevail of our militaries is now available to people off the shelf. And because cybercrimes are not constrained by borders, their actions open up questions about accountability, traceability, and consequences when things go wrong. President Ramaphosa has set up the 4IR Commission, focusing on the immense economic and developmental benefits of new technology. But it's viewed largely through an economic prism, with a promise that 1 million more young people will be trained as data experts in the next decade. That's really impressive, and it is important, and it is ambitious. But I would contend that this is only a partial picture, and it can't be done without understanding the potential threats of new tech. Don't get me wrong, they are fantastic examples on this continent of where new technologies are improving human security. One example is the movie microchip card in Kenya, which seeks to help counter-terrorism officers operate in the Lamu area, distinguish between fishermen trying to earn a living and Al-Shabaab militants. But what happens if those microchip fishermen and the data from them falls into the wrong hands? Is that going to be used to extort? Is that going to be used to threaten communities? We just need to build resilience to know how we deal with those kinds of situations. There's an awful lot to digest, and I don't want to overwhelm you. Today, though, this is about laying the foundations. We want to look at the physical threats, with the main focus being on South Africa. What is law enforcement capable of doing? And what are the plans for a national 24/7 cybersecurity centre, as set out by our president? We are hoping to examine the bigger picture, and we will have a number of seminars in the preceding months. But we're trying to also understand what's being done at the international level to regulate cybersphere, the establishment of new norms or new regimes, and what should be the consequences of such strategies. And where does Africa in general and South Africa in particular fit in to those big global conversations? Now, we have guests here today from law enforcement, from government, diplomatic missions, academia, the banking sector, big tech companies, as well as civil society. So it should be a really fruitful discussion, and I heartily welcome all of you. We've got a slight amendment to our panel. Our panelist lineup is shifted slightly. Brigadier Peterson from the South African Police Service unfortunately can't join us for medical reasons. And Ambassador Timo Costa, who is the Dutch ambassador at large with responsibility for cybersecurity, struggled to make his flight, owing rather unfortunately to a suicide on the train line en route to the airport. So unfortunately he's had to pull out. He was delayed in getting his flight. However, we have a highly experienced team of panelists here. They think that I'm just backing them, but they are highly experienced, who we're going to introduce in just a moment. I'm going to hand over to our chair, Otilia Manganidze. She is the head of special projects here at ISS, who will be chairing this session, and we very much look forward to getting your input. And please welcome our panelists.
Thank you very much, Karen. I don't think I could have introduced the theme any better. It's obviously a topic, just from the video that we watched, that ought to affect as many of us as possible. But very few people know the substance of cybersecurity, cyberspace, or even more daunting, very few people understand cybercrime. So whether it is traditionally the advanced fee fraud from Nigeria that people know as the 419 scam, that's evolved from just your ordinary direct communication to using mobile phones, which there are 930 million of them on the African continent alone, a continent of 1.2 billion people. That means the good is amazing and impacts our daily lives, the way we communicate, the way we engage with each other in a positive way. But it also means that the threats themselves need the right kind of response, the right kind of action to ensure that we leverage as much of the good. Henriette and Professor Bassi van Solms today will help us at least unpack and understand some of those dynamics, particularly how states are responding or how states should and can respond. Henriette Esterhuizen is a commissioner on the Global Commission of the Stability of Cyberspace and also the executive director of the Association of Progressive Communications, someone with a strong background in human rights law, particularly trying to ensure that the law meets the developments that are ongoing. So we don't have cybersecurity moving way ahead of the law, but we're able to address it properly. Professor Bassi van Solms from the University of Johannesburg has been teaching computer science and software engineering before it became fashionable. For over 30 years, he's been helping students understand computers, but importantly, hopefully, also ensuring that people like yourself and I, who aren't students of computer science, who aren't students of software engineering, also benefit from the things that he teaches. He's the director for the Center of Cybersecurity at the University of Johannesburg and is affiliated also with Oxford and the World Economic Forum. So by no measure do we have second best today. We have a great panel, a panel that will hopefully help us understand some of the issues. Henriette, I'm going to start with you. Let's start global before we go local. What are some of the ways in which, at the global level, there have been efforts to begin to ensure that cyberspace is not something up there, but something that people can understand, but also regulate?
Thanks, Otelia, and thanks to Karen and to ISS. Just one minor correction. I'm no longer executive director. After 17 years, I stepped down. I still work with the Association for Progressive Communications. I think it is really challenging for states to collaborate, but yes, there are efforts. At United Nations level, there was the group of governmental experts, which is a mechanism made up of a subsection of member states that live in the first committee of the United Nations General Assembly. And that really has been, within that intergovernmental space, one of the primary ways of dealing with cyber security. Unfortunately, as is often the case, when you need governments to agree with one another, it doesn't always proceed very smoothly. In the 2015 phase of this, it's known as the GGE, the Group of Governmental Experts, there was actually agreement on norms, and they came up with 11 quite common sense norms about how states should behave responsibly in times of conflict, any kind of conflict, including cyber conflict. Then there was a second phase, and that was the 2017 phase, where they in fact could not agree, and the whole process collapsed. And the status at the moment is that there were two resolutions last year. It's all backed by geopolitics. One from the United States to re-establish the GGE, and in fact South Africa, that has happened. South Africa and Kenya are both members of that. And then there was a competing resolution from the Russians to establish an open-ended working group, which is a more inclusive process, also in the first committee of the UN. And their states will thrash out some of the broader issues around cybersecurity, such as other confidence-building measures, capacity building, for example. And then there are regional. I mean, Karen and we heard about the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, the Malabar Convention, which in fact has not had the African Union Commission who drove that really thought that would drive a continent-wide collaborative approach to addressing cybercrime and cybersecurity, but there are concerns with that. There are concerns from civil society around very vague definitions of, for example, attacks on personal dignity, for example. And then there are concerns from states that it might undermine sovereignty in some respects. Then there's also the Budapest, the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime, which in fact has really got a lot of traction in Africa, and you find that many African states who have had or are busy developing cybersecurity legislation are using that as a model. So it's a very imperfect, but I think, so on the one hand you have this layer of effort to establish more global cooperative measures between states, but that's not enough, firstly, because the issue of cybersecurity is not just a cross-border issue, it's also a cross-sector issue. How can you address these insecurities and these attacks if you're not working with the private sector, if you're not working with the people that actually run the internet and secure the internet, and if you're not dealing with people that are involved in international law, protection of human rights, for example. So there also is something else that's happening a lot at the global level, and that is bilateral relationships. So you would have some governments would, for example, form a capacity-building partnership with an African state, which would involve both supporting the development of legislation based on the Council of Europe Convention, but that would also build capacity. And China increasingly is also working bilaterally. And then the other international, more sort of solution-oriented effort, which I think should not be underestimated, is the work of Interpol. In working with law enforcement agencies, a lot of capacity building happening. Basi will know much more about that, and sometimes that's very under the radar. And that will be my final comment. I think there's a when it comes to the global layer and the global process of establishing norms for behavior, but also building capacity and collaborative problem solving, one of the real bottlenecks, in my view, is that there is often not a clear distinction between what is cybercrime and what is cybersecurity. Are we protecting the security of the users of cyberspace, people's information, companies, data, personal data, or are we protecting the security of states? And then there's another layer to that. For many states, when they look at cybersecurity, they're not even, in fact, only looking at the security of the state or national security, they're looking at it as regime security. And you often see cybersecurity legislation being developed in authoritarian states, which give governments carte blanche when it comes to surveilling communications, intercepting and monitoring communication, does very little to address the crimes that we saw is so prevalent. Crimes that affect individuals, and often poor individuals. So that, I think, is one of the bottlenecks and the challenges that needs to be addressed, whether you're working at a national level or an international level.
Thank you, Henriette. And Basi, if I may, in the spirit of conversation, I'll call you by your first name. Is that okay?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah. Henriette has already touched on two things that relate directly to the work that you do. I'm going to ask you first to respond to the first. Help us understand this distinction between cybersecurity and cybercrime. What are we talking about?
Okay, thank you very much. I see several well-known faces in the audience, very good friends, men friends and lady friends, and they all know that. And many of you know that, and I'm on record. I'm actually being blamed that I'm negative about cyberspace. I am very skeptic. I think we live in extremely dangerous times, and you all know that because you're all experts in that area. The quote that comes closest to where my feeling about cyberspace, and sorry, I'll come to your question just now, is a quote by Berners-Lee, what's the inventor of of the web and the internet. He made a quote about it last year sometime, saying, "I created a monster." And that is basically in line with my thinking. I think we as humans have created something that we can't control. And you might disagree with me, and I'm happy that we're going to have the discussion. But I think we have created, and we are feeding this monster every day. By sensors, billion of sensors, we're feeding this monster, which is going to become bigger, and is already becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. I'm also skeptic about legal aspects, conventions on the highest level, especially in South Africa. We are so used to having very good laws, very good regulations, but it's not enforced. So now to come back to your question. What's the position in South Africa? And I'm going to concentrate on that specifically in my talk, or in my discussion. Firstly, trying to answer your questions, and then as I'm standing in for Brigadier Pieterse, I will say something about the developments in the area of cybercrime. I'm involved in that, and I just came here this morning. This morning, 8 o'clock, I had a meeting with the National Commissioner of Police, General Setole, about aspects that I will put on the table a little bit now. So to come back to your question, cybersecurity and cybercrime, I think both of them has got to do with the same thing. Both cybersecurity and cybercrime has got to do with mediating the threats against a country. So the aspect is not cybersecurity and it's not cybercrime. It is the cyber threats against the country. Cybersecurity, to a big extent, is to help us to mediate those threats by providing secure measures, and I'm very happy that there are some very, very experts in this audience that can hopefully a little bit later react on the matter that in protecting this from the cybersecurity side, we pass the point where we must be reactive. We must start getting proactive, going out there, finding the bad guys. But cybersecurity is just the one side of trying to protect a country against the cyber threats. Cybercrime on the other side is there to, once the attack has happened or once the crime has happened, to get them, find them, mediate them, make sure that the crime are actually being investigated, etc., etc. So I see cybersecurity and cybercrime, and I've said it before, as two sides of the same coin, because both sides are there to protect the country against cyber threats. You cannot do it just with cybersecurity. You cannot do it just with cybercrime, with a cybercrime policy. You have to have the two. They have to work together. And those are the challenges we're going to get. We're already having in South Africa, but all over the world. But I've said at the beginning I'm skeptic, but I'm seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. And I will expand on that a little bit later. But we have to work together in South Africa. I think we can get a handle on this. We will never create a secure cyberspace. I think all of you agree with that. We will never do something that can prevent cybercrime. We will never have something that can enforce perfect cybersecurity. That's impossible. The best we can do is to limit our risks in cyberspace, because the risk will always be there. You can have whatever you want. You'll get that very, very sharp cyber crime syndicates, which will always be ahead. Wherever you are, they'll be ahead of you. So you can limit your risks. And I think there are developments in South Africa, at least, that makes me optimistic that the frame of mind is changing to limit our risks, but not in terms necessarily in terms of policies, but in terms of on-the-ground things, starting rather bottom-up. There's a lot of top-down things, the cybercrime bill and all these things, which are top-down. I see initiatives bottom-up starting to happen, and I'm optimistic about that.
Thank you very much. You actually answered what was going to be my second question to you around one, we understand that the problems are complex, which means the actions and the responses themselves also need to respond to that. We can't have a simple response. So you've alluded already to engagement with the Commissioner for Police, and also just generally the work that you have been doing with the police in trying, one, to get them to understand these issues, but to craft the right kind of response. If you can take us a bit into your confidence, Basi, and share with us what that looks like practically.
Isn't it your chance now?
No.
I'm not preempting you. Okay.
No, she asked
I
for
was forced to do this. Okay. Let me say something about this. It's interesting about. Let me start earlier this year. The South African Police Service applied to the European Union for a grant of money which was awarded. That grant was used to organize a 3-day workshop beginning of June or July in Pretoria to discuss the SAPS's national cybercrime strategy. There were a lot of people at that workshop from a wide range of bodies, from government departments, from the police service themselves, a lot of them, but also from private industry. And what I got from that, there was the first sort of light that I talked about, the first positive thing, is the police service and the National Commissioner was there too, and many of the other senior people say, we realize now, maybe they've already done it, but from the workshop, that the police cannot solve a cyber problem. Firstly, you cannot solve the cyber problem, the cybercrime problem. That is impossible, as I said. But at least you cannot limit your risks from the police side by doing it alone. So the workshop, and several of you were there, requested, but can't we have a follow-up workshop, follow-up conference, which is now scheduled sometime early next year. Yeah, because a lot of talk about at the workshop was about this whole idea of crime reporting, 24/7 point of contact, as you've seen it in the cybercrime bill, a national cyber center. Can't we get some idea from the police service where they're going with that? So another grant was awarded, and we're starting to work on that. I'm involved in that project. And my part of the project is very much to speak to the private industry. Go out there, because the private industry at that workshop, I was amazed at their commitment to help, to get involved, to help solve the problem. Now, I've been speaking to several of those bodies already. I spoke to a number of government departments, and the willingness to realize we cannot solve this in silos. We must work together. So the discussion this morning was basically just to give a report back, and maybe I can say that too. Susan, you are here. I had a very good meeting yesterday morning with Fabric, which Susan organized, and I'd like you to react on that too. And again, ladies and gentlemen, there were, I think most of the banks in South Africa were represented around that table. And the willingness, actually going so far by saying, we haven't got the skills in South Africa for cybercrime, where are we going to get them? Saying from their side that most of those skills are in the private industry, in the banks and in the other places. We're willing to make them available. We're willing to have them seconded in some way, but we're willing to help you to create capacity. We're willing to help you to, when this center is getting off the ground, to provide people initially to work with the experts in government that are there to do this. And that, I think, from my experience, and your 30 years is a little bit long, on the 1st of October this year, it's 50 years that I've been in academia. I haven't seen this commitment, this realization, and you've mentioned it, that we can only address the problem if we do something from the bottom up. And I've got the feeling that's happening. And those of you that are involved in the project or had been at the previous workshop, or even Susan from Fabric, if you don't support me, I'm going to be shot. But I think you will support me because you've also seen it. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, I told the National Commissioner this morning, we can address the problem, but we need a public-private partnership between industry and government about cybercrime, spelling out who's going to do what. Because most of the critical information infrastructure, and you know that, is not in government. Government doesn't know very much about most of the infrastructures. There are some very good expertise in the government, and I told the National Commission there too, we must use those hot expert points in the government departments. But the most of them are on the telecoms, the SASLs. They are the people that must come and tell us, these are our risks. Can we work with you? Can we actually share with you our inputs, get the inputs that you get, and create that? So that's why I'm saying I see little flickers of light, which makes me optimistic, although I'm pessimistic.
Thank you. Henriette, Bessie's spoken about a number of things. I think the issue around private-public partnerships, but just generally around making sure that the response to issues linked to the cyberspace, so let's not limit it just to very particular cyber crimes, but the range of issues do need as many of us, if I can put it that way, on board. So beyond the private sector, beyond government specifically, whether it's intergovernmental agencies or whether it's NGOs or interested parties wanting to make sure that we mitigate the problem. We know the problem, and if Bassi is to be believed, we're never going to actually fix it. But what we can do is we can be able to mitigate it. I'd like you to speak a little bit on two aspects. So the first is around this proactive engagement. Is the law lagging, firstly? But then the second thing is really, to share with us a bit, because we learn as we go. Other countries or other jurisdictions have had to deal with some of the issues that we are yet to face. If you can share with us, Henriette, some best practices, some things that can maybe give Bassi hope, definitely give me hope, but maybe give Bassi also some hope.
A little bit more.
A little bit more.
Yeah.
That's it's a tough question to answer. I want to start in responding to your first one, the proactive engagement, and responding to Bassi's skepticism about policy, which I share. But I also believe that policy matters, because I think policy, it tells the story of what you as a country or as a regional entity, what you believe and what your vision is for responding to this monster that we are creating, have created and feeding. And so I think policy is lagging and law is lagging behind. And I think, you need to, just to take a country like South Africa and many other developing states, yes, we have to respond to these threats. We need to establish security to respond to the emerging challenges, but we also need to strengthen our democracy. We need to deal with jobs. We need to deal with the vast inequalities that we have in this country. And also rule of law, and what is our response to cyber security and cyber crime? What say about where we stand with regard to that? And I don't think one should become preoccupied. I think having a solution-oriented, bottom-up approach is absolutely critical. But somehow you also have to, even if you don't do it every month, but at least periodically, connect the dots. And I think that to me is often almost a concern, because what I see states doing, and I actually have less experience in South Africa, I have to say, than many other parts of the world, is that they tend to, their response to developing cyber legislation, capacity, development, investment, and policy is often defined by fear rather than by the positive potential. And I think that has a negative impact. So I think law is lagging behind in in connecting the dots. I think you need to look at how can you effectively respond, strengthen your cybercrime enforcement capacity, but without weakening rule of law. In fact, you should be strengthening rule of law in doing that. And in the same way that with so-called offline crime, I also don't really believe in this separation between crime that is online, that's cybercrime, and crime that's in the so-called real world. You need good capacity, but you also need protections and you need procedures. And I think that's very important. And take something like South Africa's regulation of interception of communications, for example, RICA. That's being challenged in court at the moment because there are weaknesses. There are rights, data protection, there are human rights weaknesses in that. And you don't want to deal with that. So if you are developing a cyber crime or security, and I agree with the way you frame it, Basi, response, be it a capacity building, bottom-up solution-oriented response, or a legislative or normative response, you need to make sure that that response is not going to weaken your goals as a country that respects human rights, that values freedom of expression, and people's right to privacy. And at a very concrete level, you have something like our POPI, Protection of Personal Information Act in South Africa, very good textbook piece of legislation. And you don't want that legislation to be undermined or contradicted by any measures that are being undertaken to address cybercrime. So my response to you, Basi, would be that, yes, you need the private sector, you need government, you also need your human rights lawyers there to be part of that process, to have a collaborative response that actually avoids some of these bottlenecks that could emerge, which did, in fact, in South Africa happen very much with the first version of the cybercrime and cybersecurity legislation, which in fact had to go back to the drawing board immediately. So I think, but I do think laws lagging behind. I absolutely think it is very important. But I would say that if I had to choose between what to do first, develop a new piece of legislation or develop a bottom-up collaborative response, I would start with the bottom-up collaborative response and then draw on that experience and that community in developing this legislation. Instead of having this legislation sitting up there, I often think Africa is like, we have a cloud of policies floating above the continent, and that's what they do. They float above the continent. No capacity, states don't have the capacity to implement them, and there's no real monitoring and follow-up. So I do think that connection is important, and starting from the bottom. In terms of best practice in other jurisdictions, well, I didn't mention I'm the member of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, which is a multi-stakeholder commission that's developing norms. It brings together people from a state like Singapore, for example, who has a very advanced capacity, legislative and institutional capacity with dealing with cybercrime and cybersecurity, and then European governments, like the Netherlands and others. I think that the jurisdictions where there is good practice, definitely Europe. And I think Europe, because it has institutional capacity and it has regional institutional capacity, which leans itself, it lends itself to this type of cross-border challenge. Plus, you have human rights mechanisms. You've got the Council of Europe. You have the court, the European Court. Then you have very strong communications. The Commission has got very strong regulatory capacity. It has legislative capacity. It has a strong civil society. It has industry groups. So I think that is a good case scenario. And then I think what you also see in Africa I would say it's a good practice, but it's also a weakness. A state like Rwanda, for example, where you would have quite effective response, very centralized coordination and control, but then often at the expense of freedom of expression, of an independent media. People who feel often that cybersecurity efforts are actually designed not just to secure cyberspace, but also to secure the current regime in power. So Yeah, I'm not. I actually think I think Ghana is another country where you have seen a good practice example of developing the legislation. That's the other thing, Basi. I think often, particularly in developing countries, the process of developing legislation can be the entry point to developing a more collaborative approach and building more capacity. It can also bring resources, and you have that in Ghana, where you have some aid that's gone into developing cybercrime capacity and legislation, and that has now been used as a way of having quite a multi-stakeholder approach to it. So, and then just finally, I do think South Africa's the development of legislation here, for me, is actually a good case, and it demonstrates how good our legislative process, the extent to which there is public participation, the fact that civil society and private sector interest could send version 1 of our legislation back to the drawing board, and that it's been redrafted. It's a much better piece of legislation now than it was. That, to me, is also a good case example.
Thank you, Henriette. As we start to wrap up this part of the discussion, because there's quite a lot of expertise within the room, so we would like to also benefit from that. Henriette, you said policy matters, which for the Institute for Security Studies goes without saying. For us, policy does matter. But the second thing also that matters for us, both you and Basi have spoken about this, is practice. So practice that meets the policy, that ensures that these things speak to each other. I'm going to throw a rather difficult question. I'm going to ask that both of you, if you can, respond to it. And it's in the hypothetical. Supposing today, hopefully immediately after the seminar, not right now, there was a denial of service attack on Eskom. Eskom provides electricity, when it does, to the Republic of South Africa, but also to neighboring countries. So supposing it happened right in this moment. You've spoken about proactive engagement, about collaboration. I'll start with you, Basi. What's the kind of immediate response that we would expect to come in response to that attack? Would the lights come on quickly, or would we be waiting for a while?
Let me start one step back, and if you allow me, as a Christian, can I quote the Bible?
You may.
Bring the Bible in line with cybersecurity. Now, I think it's Paul which says somewhere, do the one and do not leave the other one. And I want to bring that in terms of top-down and bottom-up.
Yeah.
Get your top-down thing. Always, policies, conventions are important. Surely they must be there. But don't think that's going to solve the problem. Yeah. Do the bottom-up thing. And at the moment, with all due respect, even with the new cybercrime bill, they don't match. The industry is finding it extremely difficult to perform some of the things that are prescribed by the cybercrime. And I think that's another issue. You can do top-down, bottom-up, but make sure that they match. And don't create extra burdens for people that must try to do that. For example, I've said I'm proactive in terms of, or I'm a supporter of being proactive, go and find the criminals. But some of the laws don't allow you to do that. And I don't think we must not therefore say we cannot do it. We must change the law to allow us to go after the criminals. So, to come back to your point, what will happen with Eskom? I think that over and above the fact that it may happen this afternoon, wherever it is, it will happen. It happened in Joburg a few weeks ago, where there was a ransomware attack and people couldn't buy money. Now, people got upset about that, but I think that's part of. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a legal guy. I'm a plain, simple technologist. But as far as that aspect is concerned, the psychologists must start playing a role and tell the people in South Africa, you will be hit by that. How are you going to prepare yourself? If you get in your car now and you drive to Joburg, and they close the road because of a crash, what do? You don't get, throw your toys out of the cot. Probably you'll do it, but you accept it because it's part of the risk of driving to Joburg. Part of the risk of having Eskom and all of these places being so cyber integrated, it's going to happen. Expect it. And I think we must go out, and again, I'm not a psychologist, but if those of you, and you've got a lot of them hopefully around here, start thinking about that. prepare the people in South Africa. Something like that will happen sometime. How are we going to prepare ourselves for that? So yes, if it happens, it all depends on what the reason for that attack is. If it is a state crime, a state-sponsored crime, who wants to take Eskom off the air totally forever, they can do it. There's no doubt about it. If it is just a small syndicate that wants to get some money through RAM attacks, they can do it. But I've got no doubt about it that the technology, the sophistication of cyber criminals are such that they can do that. However good we protect it, it will happen. And how prepared are we psychologically, because it is going to happen.
Henriette.
Well, I think that we firstly, we probably won't hear about it for a few weeks, which I think, firstly, I think every company, whether you're a state-owned enterprise or a public entity or any business, or even an institution, a university, I think that becomes really important, is having a proactive policy. How do we communicate with our customers? How do we communicate with people whose data we hold? Then I think, secondly, there probably will also be alarm, which might be misplaced. A DDoS attack, denial of service attack against the Eskom website. Actually, I don't think that would be that serious. I mean, do we trust the load shedding schedules we see on the Eskom website in the first place? Are they fully reliable? If it's an attack that hits Eskom's internal information management systems, that will have a much more dramatic impact than a denial of service attack against the Eskom public website. So I think, again, being specific about and understanding what the potential harm is, what the risks are, and who's affected. But I think the point behind this question, which I assume is the point, which is that we don't have coordinated good practice, coordinated information sharing, or support. And I mean, ironically, Eskom probably might actually not cope that badly, but how many other municipal entities, for example, as we've seen? Because the chances are that Eskom does either have good security personnel, or they have vendors they can draw on. They might be a company that we all see as dysfunctional at the moment, but it is a company with a huge amount of human resource capacity. But what about the many other small entities that don't have that kind of capacity? Where do they go for support? And I think that I think is a huge vacuum in South Africa. And in fact, there are other countries on the continent that have much less reliance on information, interconnected, internet-based, internet protocol-based systems, who have better emergency response systems and capacity than South Africa.
Thank you, Henriette, and thank you, Bassi. The conversation is by no way over. No, Bassi, I'm sorry.
We're going to be shot.
You have to maintain your skepticism for at least another 40 minutes. But we're opening it up now because, like I said, there's, and Bassi as well as Henriette have already alluded to that, there's a lot of people in the room with experience and knowledge, not just about the policy side or the tech side of the issues as we've covered now, but also around some of the practical responses. So now at this point, I'd like to open it up to the other side of the room, as it were. You are welcome to make a comment if you don't have a question, but also if you do have questions, please feel free to ask them. What I am going to ask, just by way of process and in keeping in the spirit of having a conversation, is that we go one person at a time, so that at least we hear a person, we listen to what they've said, and there's an opportunity to respond instead of we lose things as we go. So Elizabeth at the back has got the microphone. There's already a hand here. You go first. And please, if you can introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Anthony Cooper from CSIR. I think one benefit of all the rolling blackouts, of course, is we'd be more resilient to a cyber attack on Eskom than other countries. My concern is it says 4IR there, but in fact, none of the conversation has been about 4IR. It's really been about 3IR or maybe 3.1 IR. And I think the terminology is actually important because if we confuse people using the wrong terminology, you'll get the wrong responses and so on.
Yes, do go ahead.
My name is Matapelo from the National Treasury. So I just have one question for Basi. So you mentioned that SAPS alone is not capable, it does not have the capacity to deal with cybercrime. And as a result, you proposed a collaborative approach whereby there's a PPP, whereby every party will be responsible for a specific task. Now my question is, who then will be responsible for monitoring performance? And number two, who then will be responsible for bearing the financial implications associated with whatever plans that will be in the PPP?
Basi?
Let me just react to, I think, Anthony's comment there. You know, I see a message in there. The message I see in what is there and what has been discussed here is that, let me be critical again, the hype of 4IR is too hypey for South Africa. We've got we've got more serious problems on a lower level than now going out and say, what are we going to do with drones and self-driving cars in South Africa? Let's start bottom up and solve the problems that are there. Awareness, cybersecurity awareness, I think, is core, because every person that you can convince not to click on a link or open an attachment and therefore prevent him from doing a bad thing, you're preventing a cybercrime. So immediately, cyber awareness, again, the other side of cyber awareness is cybercrime. The more awareness you've got, the less crime you've got. So, and we aren't even there. So I think your point is extremely well, and it highlights the fact that maybe we shouldn't have been talking about 4IR, we should talk about the things that we're talking about. But a good comment. In your case, of course, it's a very good aspect, and I'm glad that you are here to give the money, all the money that the police are going to give them. That's part of what we must solve. How are we going to work with these public-private partnerships? Who's going to sponsor what? Because with all due respect, I think, and I will say that too, and people from industry here who are here, I think industry can bring more to the party. Industry, and specifically people like selling security products and antivirus products, etc., they're making a lot of money. They must bring back something to the national level. And many companies in the cyber field are making money by selling products, but causing problems to a certain extent, because that money doesn't help to address the problems which are caused by the products that they sell. So, yes, I haven't got an answer to it, but I think the moment we start really talking about public-private partnerships in the cyber field, there are a lot of players, there's a lot of parameters to be addressed, but I think the time is right now. Right from the state president, the time is right to do that and get the both parties involved. But I haven't got an answer to you. I'll just accept the money.
Henriette?
Just a very general response to the financing, and then I also want to respond to 4IR. I think that business, particularly the financial service industry, they have to protect themselves. And I think that, and they're spending money on that, insurance policies, but I think they'd be more willing to co-invest and finance government-led initiatives if there was a clear framework of collaboration, if it was clear to them that it was going to translate into concrete measures and actions. And so I think the money is there. I just think that as an entity that has to invest in information security, you have to be pragmatic about how you invest. And I think at the moment in South Africa and in many other African states, the status quo is that business invests rather in their own internal procedures and infrastructure than in collaborative infrastructures. But if the environment and if the confidence building measures, if the approach from state was such that, yes, we are in this, we are going to work collaboratively, I think you'd see a lot more money going into these public-private partnerships. The problem with the fourth industrial revolution is the fourth industrial revolution. I absolutely agree with Basi. I couldn't agree with him more. And I think that, in fact, South Africa, maybe less so than many other governments that I work with, I see a government that's just beginning to get its national broadband backbone sorted. It has the fiber capacity that it needs to bring down the cost of internet connectivity. And then suddenly the International Telecommunications Union sends a letter saying, we need your fourth industrial revolution action plan next month. Or your artificial intelligence policy, or your approach to Internet of Things. And then these states that have limited capacity drop the ball that they've been just managing to keep in the air, and they start working on the so-called fourth industrial revolution. They start developing an artificial intelligence response or an Internet of Things. I was at a meeting at the African Union Commission in May, where governments in the room said, what is this about Internet of Things? It feels to us as if our states care more now about connecting things than connecting people. You know, and I think it's maybe quite a crude comment, but I think there's an element of truth in that. And the nature of change of technology, it's fast, but it's incremental. The fourth industrial revolution is not a new thing that is suddenly going to drop into our sphere that we have to be able to respond to. There are many aspects of big data, of datafication, for example, of the proliferation of connected devices. That's happening already. We need to respond to that incrementally, but we need to respond from where we are now and what our primary challenges are. As a country, not the challenges that we are anticipating. I'm not saying you shouldn't invest in that, and I think we have enough of a academic and research and development sector in South Africa for some people to do really state-of-the-art work on robotics, for example. But if that happens without ensuring that there's equity, that there's equitable, affordable access in our schools, in our universities, in our small businesses and our large businesses, then that's just going to be another hype that will cost a lot of money and attract people to big conferences. It will not create jobs. It probably won't increase crime either necessarily, but it's not going to help us advance in terms of social and economic development.
Thank you. There's a question at the back, and then I know that Karen wants to address the 4IR issue as well. So please go ahead.
Hi there. My name's Ian from Microsoft. So a little bit of a different view on things. Just a couple of comments. One, I think the fourth industrial revolution comment, and we're not really addressing it with cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is kind of already a bygone product of earlier revolutions. I think it's true. You know, 4IR to me is more about looking at AI and business drones and things like that, but also having a look at the ethics of it, and having a look at what is happening, let's say, in the China social economy and things that are happening there. So we need policy, absolutely, to guide us in those things that are really pushing the fronts of the fourth industrial revolution. And we also need the reality of practically for most people, all we really care about is someone actually doing a cyber attack on us. So you need both of those. For me, I think of cyber security or any kind of technology tool. It's just a technology and it's just a tool. In the days gone by, we had, stethoscope was a tool that was introduced into medicine, and there was a huge backlash that it's going to take away the human touch in diagnosis and things like that. That was a tool, and that's a technology. Same kind of thing for looking at an artificial intelligence. For me, it is not an artificial intelligence. That's the wrong name. It's an alternate intelligence. Using an alternate intelligence is just another tool. Think of it as like using a dog and finding a missing person or something like that. You're using skills that are not human, they're something else, but you're using them for good. And you need to figure out the ethics behind it as well. Just a thought there.
Absolutely.
I think
Thank you very much for that comment. Karen.
And
As a former journalist, can I say I'm absolutely delighted that we've got you responding to the 4IR title, because you've underscored the point that we're trying to make, and it's this idea of running before you can walk. There's a lot of hype, and there's a lot of language that gets flung around, and we've usurped some of the language that's likely to dominate during the World Economic Forum next week to be able to find it as an entry point for this. And I think there is this phrase, trying to run before you can walk. And I think with conversations that I've had with Basti in particular in the past about a South African solution to the very practical problem of cyber attacks, which is what we're talking about at the moment, is an absolute must. And we've seen in other areas of policy, maybe in education, maybe in healthcare, one could argue, that we've always been striving to get the best that's available in America or in Sweden or in other European countries. We need to have a South African solution to this. So we've deliberately used the title to try and draw you in, get you hot under the collar, and I'm so pleased you've responded.
Thank you. If you can pass the microphone right behind you, Karen. Yes.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Susanne Portuguesa from Sabric. I'd like to just respond to some previous comments already made, if I may. First, I'd like to start off by just making a comment about my own view, our lack of understanding of the impact of interconnectivity, dependencies, and convergence even of industries. I don't think we've really unpacked that sufficiently in this country. And, you spoke about if Eskom goes down, what will happen. I mean, it's going to affect so many industries. It's just ridiculous. So I think there's lots more to be said about that. Just moving on to the cybercrime bill, and I speak from a banking industry perspective, and I'd like to just latch on to the point made that you have policy and then you have legislation without sort of understanding the practicalities and probably missing out on a couple of tricks because you haven't consulted widely enough with industries. By way of example, is in the bill, for example, at the moment there's going to be quite a onerous reporting obligation on the banking industry, but it goes beyond that. The bill says that financial institutions have a duty to preserve evidence. Now, has anybody thought of what that actually means? It literally means that, and I'm making a very bizarre example now, excuse me for it, that every time the financial sector is touched by a crime, there is in law a responsibility to protect that evidence. Now for how long? Now we're talking about retention of records. We're talking about admissible evidence. Has anybody thought about what the data elements are? Has anybody thought about how it's going to be stored? All of those kind of things. So there's a lot of work still to be done. If we talk about law enforcement and capabilities, and Basi touched on a whole lot of those things, we as a banking industry are concerned that we're talking about a cybercrime bill, but at a charge station or at a police office today, there are still some officers who refuse to accept a statement if it's not handwritten. It has to be handwritten. Now, if you say reporting obligation on the financial institutions to report crime, is there a common understanding that we will not be queuing at charge offices? There's got to be, it's going to have to be, it's going to have to be a different model altogether. We are big supporters of law enforcement, and I can give you the assurance that the financial services sector will really, really be at the forefront of any talks about partnerships and so forth. But I think we can bring far more to the table than just money, and by that I mean donations. We've got a wealth of experience, practical experience, again, if we talk about reporting crime, has anybody thought, does the state know what are the data elements that will enable the state to identify digital perpetrators, transnational organized criminals sitting in other jurisdictions? I can tell you we've got a good idea of what those data elements are, and if we can partner, we can talk about these things. I do believe that the partnership between government and private industry has the ability to shorten the learning curve of government substantially. So why make mistakes, sort of trial and error? Why not shorten that period by actually consulting and partnering? And of course, we are ready to participate in that. Just two more comments, and then I'm going to leave my crusade. I've got lots more to say, but let me just make two comments. I'm also a little bit personally concerned about how we're going to deal, both in private and in public sector, with upskilling of resources versus recruitment policies. I think it's pie in the sky to think that everybody in a current position can be upskilled effectively to become a cyber warrior, for lack of a better term. And I think we're going to have to look at recruitment, very robust recruitment strategies, and not rely only on upskilling. Then last but not least, I do believe that given that big data is common practice these days, our policing strategy has to be changed, and we need to invest in analysts, and we need to invest in robust data management within law enforcement. Otherwise, we're going to miss the boat, my own view. Thanks.
Thank you very much. If you could just pass the microphone, thank you, Elizabeth, to the High Commissioner for the United Kingdom. He's right here in front.
Thanks. Thanks very much. I'm Nigel Casey. I'm the British High Commissioner. I just wanted to touch on the international aspects of this story with a comment and a question, a bit of information sharing. First of all, I very much like the emphasis you've both put on bottom-up, nationally led efforts, because you're right that there is an international debate on cybersecurity. But it's hamstrung by a very fundamental philosophical and political difference of approach, which we must acknowledge and recognise is going to be a barrier to securing international rules of the road, which are meaningful. And as you rightly said, Henriette, even if we did that, there's a real risk that they wouldn't sort of float above people's heads if there's not the capacity to implement bottom up. So I'd be interested to hear from you about how you see this working in terms of international collaboration, in terms of the work that you're doing, including with SAPS. We have offered through DTPS here to conduct a baseline review of cyber hygiene in South Africa across the private sector and government, and on the back of that to provide some further advice on cybersecurity, focusing largely, as you say, on the private sector, the banking system in particular. And if that goes ahead, we would look forward to working with banks and with Fabric and others to roll that out, as well as in parallel some wider information and messaging through schools and to the public on basic cybersecurity, because I totally agree with you, Bassi, that this is much about what people and organisations do to protect themselves, rather than waiting for governments who don't necessarily have the same capacity or resources to do it for them. So I'm interested to know what international links you're already pursuing in the work you're doing, or is it purely national so far? And do you see scope for working with partners around the world to push this in South Africa? Just to finish, I should just explain why we're doing it, because it's the way we see this is it's about as much about economic growth and inclusion as anything else. We are trying to help more South Africans get online, and we want people to have a positive experience online. If the first experience of going into the online economy is having your bank account hacked, you're not going to stay there, and then you're likely to be disadvantaged when it comes to playing a full role in the economy. There is a big digital divide in South Africa already. We want to try and help close that, because it's whether we like it or not, the internet is fundamental to our economic futures, and we literally can't afford not to be part of it, and so we need to try and protect ourselves from the negative aspects and police it as best we can. Thanks.
Thank you. Basi, if you can respond, as well as Henriette, I'm sure. And then if I could just get an indication from the audience of people who do want to make comments or questions. Okay? All right. Basi, Henriette.
Well, thank you for your comment. I think it highlights a couple of issues. Just to come back to the international issue as such. Look, I'm not in the police service, but at the workshop I referred to, the 3-day workshop, firstly it was sponsored by the EU, so that says something in terms of international cooperation. And one of the speakers was one of the senior managers of Europol. And she provided a lot of input. She put the whole willingness on the table to help in the creation of this National Cybercrime Center, etc. But one quote she made, which I will remember always, is, look, it took Europol 10 years to where we are now. Don't think you're going to do it in 1 year. And I think that reality was brought in from their side. So surely they are involved. The second comment is that the present project from the national cybercrime issue is divided into two legs. I'm working on the leg with local industry, getting the feeling from local industry, getting some way of feeding back saying, yes, this PPP thing is important. The second leg is another person who will actually visit, I think, 4 national cybercrime centers in Europe and some in Africa to determine a set of best practices. And then those 2 legs will come together, and hopefully we can create in our report, these number of scenarios supported by international best practices coming from these types of visitors. But I must say that too. About 4 weeks ago, I was in the UK. I visited the National Crime Agency, and I actually visited the National Cybersecurity Unit within the National Crime Agency. And I was amazed. I think they've got more people in that cybercrime unit than we've got in the whole cyber community in South Africa. So, really the penny again dropped to me. You've got a first world solution which is unbelievably sophisticated. And the guy that I spoke to, he was one of a few people having a responsibility. And his responsibility was totally dedicated to going out to schools and to people, etc., promoting the aspect of being cyber aware. Because being cyber aware, you're going to prevent cyber crimes. So yes, I think there's a lot to be learned from what I saw there. But I will not be on this trip, fortunately. But these best practices will. And then I'd like to take up with you. I'm not sure you referred to review, whether you referred to an Oxford CMM review, but I'll take that up with you.
Thank you, Henriette.
Thanks, Ottilia. Just quickly in response to Susan, I really like how you framed it, and I think that's, you need to deal with threats and to deal with opportunity, which is, 4IR supposedly presents opportunity. You need an ecosystem approach. We would have all read about the drone in the vicinity of Oliver Tambo International last week, which caused delays in flights. Now, that is a 4th industrial revolution type problem, but to solve that problem, you need a functioning civil aviation authority that needs regulation that is enforced on dealing with drone. You need good communication capacity. You need a partnership between your airport authority, your civil aviation authority, law enforcement, etc. So often, I think there's a tendency in developing countries to think that the solution to new problems is new solutions, when in fact it's just investing in good human capacity, institutional capacity, procedures, good communication, information sharing is going to take you a lot further than having a very expensive 4th Industrial Commission that will come up with recommendations which likely will join the cloud of policy and implementation.
Very funny little thing on drones.
Sorry.
The Belgian police.
I didn't want to give the floor to him. Sorry, I wasn't.
The Belgian police have been investigating using falcons to actually down drones in certain areas.
Yeah.
So it's a old solution to a new problem.
So just to respond to the High Commissioner, I think this is a really tough issue, and I'm very glad to hear you are doing this, because I think there's a need to depoliticize international engagement. I think South Africa, I encounter and work a lot with the South African government at international level, because I do the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, and we do a lot of work in the United Nations. And I'm always extremely disappointed to see South Africa, when it is joining, and I don't know if there's anyone here from DIRCO in the room, but that there are these pre-negotiated alliances with Saudi Arabia, for example. And part of it makes sense because it's part of BRICS, and South Africa is part of Brazil, India, China, South Africa, and they have positions on cybersecurity. There was, until quite recently, a BRICS demand for a global cybersecurity treaty, which is it's a real divisive demand in the international space, because Russia, India, South Africa Brazil has been wanting this, and many of the Western and North American, European states definitely do not want a treaty for various reasons we don't have to go into. But I think if South Africa could have a more pragmatic approach, obviously there are alliances, South Africa is part of certain international groupings, but there's a lot to be gained from South Africa forming alliances with European states, for example, or being more active in the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that works on this, and actually supporting international decisions which could strengthen security and human security, not just information security. And I think often South Africa is losing in a way its place and its capacity to be an innovator and a leader in international discussions around cybersecurity, and particularly in African discussions, partly because it has this quite narrow, locked in geopolitical relationships with states, which in fact South Africa has very little in common with, Saudi Arabia being a case in point. But I think this is a challenge also for the international spaces. Just to respond, get back to the High Commissioner. Cybersecurity issues are generally dealt with in blocks, where you have countries that are so-called like-minded countries. And usually in international negotiations, when it's like-minded countries negotiating with one another, you will not get anywhere, because you will never find consensus except on some really basic things. What we see in a body like the Human Rights Council, which was deadlocked and was kind of recreated, they have a core group approach, where if there's a new resolution that's being dealt with, including internet-based resolutions, they have a core group of countries that are convened that are not necessarily like-minded. And what this means is that the negotiation, you have China working together with the Netherlands, for example, or the internet resolution is Nigeria and Turkey and Sweden, for example. And then you actually have some of that, the geopolitical bottlenecks are negotiated more in closed rooms, quietly, and by the time a resolution goes into the intergovernmental space, it's likely to be more consensus-based. A little bit like you said, that our policy is more implementable if you consult with the people that have to implement it. But in cybersecurity at the moment, internationally, I'm afraid, what you're doing, I think, is the best possible thing, which is this kind of capacity building, relationship building, that's a little bit under the radar of formal international negotiations.
Thank you. We do have time for 3 more questions. I've noted you, the person next to you, as well as you. So you can start.
Thank you. She said I must start. I just want to start with a comment that says that we are not as at risk as many other countries that are hyper-connected. So the masses in South Africa are not as connected as Estonia and the United States. So an attack on Facebook in another country that's highly connected would not have the same effect on South Africa and many African countries. So sometimes we tend to scare each other on the basis of what has happened in some of these countries, which I think we just need to balance out. We need to work on the numbers. When we then have the numbers in terms of the percentages of people that are connected in a country, maybe in South Africa what we then need to do is to make sure that when the people get connected, they get connected in a safe way. They already are aware of what they can do, what they must not do. Now, you've spoken about the partnerships with the private sector. One understands that. Now, the definition, I think, is that the cyberspace is one that is man-made. Now, the question that I think we need to ask ourselves is what does the man-made nature of the cyberspace mean? And what my answer to that is that, in our case, is that it's owned primarily by the private sector. But what is even worse for South Africa and many other African countries is that the private sector is foreign. So it's the same as having a mountain and a valley that is from another country in your country, and now you have to protect it. Whereas chances are, if they don't like you, they can just turn against you. So one good example from Microsoft is that some departments in South Africa have moved to Office 360, which is the cloud. Now what does that mean? When you've moved to the cloud, which is, again, from Microsoft, which is not South African. Now that means that we first have to understand that the man-made nature of it means we need to own, which talks to sovereign capability. Now, until we have that in place, until we own that cyberspace which is man-made, obviously the EMS is not, I think we can never talk about being able to secure it, because then you'll always have the insider threat issue, where the country that dominates or critical infrastructure in terms of the technology, if they don't like you one day, that means they become your threat, and already you rely so much on them. So our dependence on foreign technology is our biggest threat now. So the sooner we move towards having our own capabilities, the better. Because that's the only thing that I think we need to look at. Now in terms of whether the 4IR and all those things, African countries have been able to leapfrog. There was a time when we were talking about getting every home to have a telephone number, the typical one that were the wires. But then when the cell phones came, Africa has taken that up, and there's many people that are using cell phones. So some of these technologies, we actually can just get into them and use them. But with everything that we do, it has to be to our advantage. But the sooner we get rid or we minimize our reliance and dependence on foreign technology, we will never be secure.
Thank you. If you can introduce yourself, please.
I'm given, until just recently I was in government, but now I'm a student and I'm unemployed.
Right. We don't laugh at the unemployed part. It's a career change. Yourself, please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Cindy. I'm from Jericho. Adriette has put me on the bit of the defensive, because I'm also the rep on the open-ended working group and the advisor for the GGB rep. But I won't let you put me on the defensive, Henriette, because I actually had a very good story of South Africa to tell. And one was to thank you guys for the discussion on the distinctions between cybercrime, cybersecurity, because what we're finding internationally is that there are more convergences than divergences on the issues. And in this, we're talking, in my space, we talk about international cybersecurity and not necessarily the cybersecurity that is antivirus, that, stuff like that. But the one thing that I wanted to add about what South Africa is doing is that we are also chairing the Intergovernmental Expert Group on Cybercrime in Vienna. And this year we were looking at issues related to law enforcement and electronic evidence. And I just wanted to pick up on what cybercrime was saying about the preservation of data, and that's exactly what even at states level we are discussing in very in-depth talks about how do we do that in a way that does not violate industry norms or even data protection laws in the respective jurisdictions. And so we'll talk. But the other thing on the cybersecurity, the international aspect that I wanted to add is that as states realize that the landscape evolves so quickly, we're also very aware that states cannot move so quickly. And for South Africa, we've always accepted that we shouldn't try actually to even keep up with everything. What we should be able to do is to be responsive and to also be proactive. And by proactive, I mean we believe that regional engagement, regional interaction is actually going to be what is going to be the building blocks towards securing cyberspace for the continent. And we'll be meeting now in October and also having our GGE regional consultations. And part of that is exactly what has been discussed in the room, that we don't face all the same dangers. South Africa maybe more than others because of our advanced economic systems. I know we rank third on some other index, but I know SABRIC issued a statement about the way that that assessment is made. But what South Africa is looking at now, and within the UN broadly, we are starting to think about an end state. What is it that we are doing in the different multilateral forums? When we're talking about cybercrime in Vienna and we talk about cybersecurity in New York, what is the end state? And we're hoping that we can all work towards a body of knowledge that is going to be able to remove these, I'll use my colleagues' term, man-made distinctions, because today it's cyber war, tomorrow it's cyber espionage, tomorrow it's cyber this, but at the end of the day, we all have to secure the cyberspace. And for states, most importantly, we have to protect it against each other, right? And so we have to start looking in more creative ways at the architecture we have, the international law, the norms like you were mentioning, which are really common sense, right? Which state would allow an agency to launch a cyber attack against another country in its jurisdiction? No one, unless that's what you wanted to do.
Unless you want to do
right?
it.
And so that's what that's what South Africa is going to be adding now to the UN debates. How do we turn those norms into implementable action, and how do we help states, and then by that states to empower their industry or have a conversation with their industries on how to actually do that. And so my question for you was going to be what do you think would be, what is the model for private-public engagement and interaction on the international stage? Is everyone a friend? Or, are past foes supposed to turn into friends? How do we actually do that? What model do we use for that kind of consultations at that level? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will just have the last question or comment, and then I'll hand over to you to respond to them, but also to give us your last thoughts.
Thank you. Yep. Good. So my name's Jasper Edrich. I'm a forensic accountant. I used to work at the Bodo Forensic Accounting, but I had to retire when I hit 65 not so long ago, which means I've got time now to sort of get much more interested in following all these kind of debates and things that one needs to know professionally. I've only got my things are comments. I think the first comment that struck me when I came in here, I apologise, a bit late, and the first few comments was having been to a few events, which I just want to mention in a minute, all about this topic recently. What strikes me is that there are a lot of professions, industries, businesses, government departments, etc., which are all looking at these issues and having conferences and meetings like this. And I just want to advocate that the need for the whole issue, the whole subject matter, to be dealt with much more on a coordinated approach. Because there's people running here, people running there, talking about this, talking about that and the other, and it's like a Catherine wheel, spinning off in all directions at the moment, in my view. The other thing is that, the examples I want to give are, for example, the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants next week is holding a 3-day conference because it's its 100th anniversary of that institute in Cape Town. And I wanted to go, but I looked through the agenda, and I can't remember, probably about 80% of the speakers and the topics, they're all brilliant people, all well known, and they're all related to what we're talking about here today. The Ethics Institute, another organisation just up the road here in South Africa, which is doing tremendous work, also had a big discussion about this very recently as well. And the outcome of that, I think, for me was that whenever anyone decides anything to do with this topic and the decision which way to go, you can do good with it or you can do damage with it, and you've got to look at the ethics of the decision you're making and what does the most good for the most people or what does the least damage to the least people. That kind of decision-making approach. And there's another one. I can't remember. I think it might have been one of the forensic professions, the ICFP, had a speaker from the military, and for him, and it sounded horrific, talking about human security. So we're saying that there needs to be strict control or policy. We've got to be very careful that with weapons that can fly, missiles that can fly from Russia to America, and they're all controlled automatically. And the decision as to when to push the button to let this thing fly, and it all flies because it's working with fourth industrial revolution technologies, which all builds on itself, so they don't need people to be involved at all. So, and the thing can be triggered by artificial intelligence as well when a certain algorithm or set of circumstances arises. You have to use your imagination for that one, which suddenly means that as everything gets more and more automated and building itself and turning into self-generating robots, somebody's going to have control over destroying humankind, and it won't be a human. He was pointing out that risk and how it can be guarded against. I was going to list all the institutes that I'm aware of that are looking at this, but that's enough. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bassi and Henriette, in response to what has been raised, but also any sort of quick concluding thoughts from your side. I'll start with you, Bassi.
Okay, let me firstly go back to our representative from DIRCO. Thanks for your comments. I think your question of how should such a public-private partnership look is part of the discussion. And I don't think there's a template that happens. It'll happen between the government and the relevant constituency that they work in. For example, if the South African government wants to go into a PPP with, let's say, the cyber people in South Africa, the banking industry, the Sabrics, the ISPAs, that will be totally different in terms of the problems and the agreements and the MOUs that will be in there than if they go into an agreement with, let's say, the companies in the waste management area. Say we want to have a PPP between the government and the waste management industry. I think a lot of different aspects in there will be different. But the point you make is very good in terms that one have to discuss this. If the government now says fine and private industry says fine, these financial industries etc. fine, let's sit around a table. Then a lot of these things are going to be discussed and included in that public-private partnership. It's an important aspect, but I don't think there's a template. And maybe that's one of the problems, that we try to use existing templates and enforce it in environments where it shouldn't be. That's my first comment. My second comment to your colleague there, I don't agree with you. Plain common. I can't see how you can, on a national level, how you can own cyberspace. I just think it's not possible. Secondly, I don't agree with you that technology, foreign technology causes the problem. So what I'm saying to you is, if you're a student and you've got a supervisor, please speak to him to make sure that you are on the right track.
Right, Henriette.
Yes, I agree with Basi. I think for national investment in institutional and human capacity to innovate, to be able to use and create technology, absolutely. But the notion that we need to own or even control, technology is a bit like music. It's at its strongest and its most creative and innovative when you draw on the fact, and particularly the world of the internet and cyber, that it is connecting so many different experiences and knowledge and approaches. So I think that I know South Africa at the last G7 meeting G20 meeting in Japan, South Africa joined with other countries who did not want to sign on to a G20 agreement to not localize data. Now, I think that's an interesting debate, but not one that we're having now. But in general, I agree with you. With DIRCO, absolutely. I'm so pleased that South Africa is on the GGE and on the open-ended working group, and I think that already is from a geopolitical level. South Africa is then going to be an active partner in both a U.S. Initiated process as well as a Russian Federation initiated process. And I think South Africa has so much to contribute to that. I think how to strengthen it really, I think go to the global spaces with a national position that has been developed with input from multiple stakeholders. And I think that because what often happens, I think, with South Africa, not only South Africa, with other international missions as well, you get to a global space, you don't necessarily have a very well-developed national position from capital. You have some red lines, and then it's the sort of group country like-minded approach prevails, rather than actually reflecting what is the prevailing stance on an issue at national level. And I think the challenge is that you have to bring together DIRCO, the relevant line ministries and departments, which is always very challenging, and your non-state actors. But I think doing that and just having a little bit more preparatory work, for example, has DIRCO or any other departments had any kind of convening in South Africa about being on the GGE and the open-ended working group, asking for input, saying, what should we as South Africa bring to the space? What are our bottom lines? And I think that will strengthen the impact of South Africa in those spaces and the benefit that the country and its citizens derive from South Africans' presence in those spaces. So I think, and I know it's not easy because you have to. DIRCO, in fact, is always the easiest actor. It's the line departments often that are not. And I just want to close on talking about the Global Commission and the norms we've developed. Have a look at them. The website is cyberstability.org. To some extent, they are norms that they're different from the GGE norms. The GGE norms address just governments. It's good behavior for governments. And as you say, they are commonsensical. The Global Commission norms, we've developed norms that are also applicable to non-state actors. And it tries to address a little bit of the murkiness of often a cyber attack is committed by a non-state actor, but it might or might not have the support of a state actor. And it also addresses the issue of cyber hygiene, as Basi said, how important it is to invest in that, and processes like vulnerability equity processes. So have a look at those norms, cyberstability.org. There's something called the Singapore Norms Package, and they intended to sort of bring together both state actors and non-state actors in trying to develop ways of behaving responsibly and usefully.
Thank you very much.
I'm worried about his students. My supervisors will only worry about me, but I'm worried about his students, and if I have access to them, I'll tell them to assist.
There's two of them at the back there, you can speak to them.
I'm worried about the others that we can take this outside.
No, I'd like to speak to you about that. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your concern for each other and the people that you work with. Thank you, Henriette Esterhazen, for taking time to share with us thoughts, particularly on the global norms, but also some best practices and spaces where we can learn from and draw on now, while we are in the third industrial revolution in South Africa, but also as we try to embark potentially on the revolution to come. And to you, Professor Bassi van Solms, thank you for your engagement in helping us in understanding the range of issues around cyber security, cyber crime, but also around the technical response and action. A special thanks to Karen Allen for organizing this event, the colleagues who've helped to support it, but a particular thank you to everyone who made it here. And those who are tuned in online, whether you represent a government, a private sector like Microsoft, the National Treasury or the Department of International Relations, or SABRIC, you are the actors that we hope can work together, collaborate in having the right kind of response. It also does mean engaging in a mutually respectful manner and engaging in the substance of the issues as much as possible. So I would like to thank you all for spending time with us today, but hopefully, and a bigger thank you for the engagement you will do beyond this session, because I think this is in many ways just the start of a conversation. And from my side, on behalf of the Institute for Security Studies, beyond thanking you, we wouldn't be able to convene this session without the aid of our donors. So I would like to thank the members of our partnership forum that are the Hans Seidel Foundation, the European Union, the governments of Australia, Canada, Finland, Ireland, and the kingdoms of Denmark, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. Thank you very much, everyone. To those of you who are here, you're welcome to join us for lunch. To the online audience, wherever you are, enjoy that as well.
Thanks for